Lance, your videos are out of date as of this morning. Did you see the new affiliation proposed comments?
Yes, I did.
So,
they're wanting to simplify affiliation, which is a great thing. So the section where we talk about affiliation in this closing certification training, we're still going to cover it, but we may have some updates as we
well, and
go
also,
through.
I mean, this is still 6 months away from being implemented, so we're don't.
Well, you take affiliation and franchises.
Yeah.
We talk about franchise eligibility in here, but SBA is proposing at some point to give you the opportunity to click on and say Lance Sexton's Car Wash franchise, and it'll tell you if it's eligible. And that'll be great.
Yeah. So that's nice. So this is a continually evolving landscape. To be clear, we're still under the existing rules for affiliation and franchise. A year from now, it'll be different, but you have to do what it says right now, even though the intent is to simplify it. We're in week 2 closing, and let's go to the polls. I'll go back, send the emails to Joseph if you have additional questions. I've seen the questions come in during the week. Thank you very much for those. You can use the chat box. There's also a handout there, just so you know, so you see you can click on that PowerPoint for your use. And also, you do not need to be here live. If for some reason you miss it, we always record these. We put them at Litmos. You can access them at your convenience. How many loan authorization changes do you normally have after getting the SBA loan approval? I assume this is on per loan, Lance?
Yes, per loan.
Hopefully it's not more than 5, but
well,
stuff happens. Stuff happens.
Part of the reason I asked this question, and this is something that I've struggled with in several different organizations that I've been a part of, the underwriting of the loan is such that after the loan is approved and an authorization is issued, it amazes me how many loan authorization change requests are required.
Right.
And I think that if the loan is underwritten and closed properly, the number should, well, this closer group, Bob, has control over minimizing the number of loan authorization changes. Now, there's some things that they can't control. Let's say that you have a piece of equipment in the use of proceeds that was originally projected at $100,000 and they're getting closer to closing and they find out that the supplier will provide it to them at $75,000.
Right.
That's a good change, but I think the objective of this closer group, 0 is hard to get to, but certainly get down to where minimize the number of loan authorization change requests that you need. I actually looked at a loan, Bob. I was reviewing a loan that had 11 loan authorization change requests, and some of them were for things like they got the middle initial of the guarantor incorrect, or they got an address incorrect.
Well, my attitude is, I don't like it either from a management standpoint, but I'd rather have 11 loan authorization changes to make sure I protect that guarantee rather than ignore it. So, but I agree with you. Underwriters should do their job. BDOs should do their job better. That's sloppy to have a mistake in the name. Have you closed a loan recently that was closed exactly the way the original SBA loan authorization indicated with no changes? Hallelujah.
That's one, Bob. I want to tell a brief story. Back when I was a very young lender, I had the pleasure of working with a company that located in Cartago, Costa Rica. And they borrowed some money from an organization called COFISA, which is kind of Costa Rica's equivalent to SBA. And when the loan closed, Bob, they broke out music and food and
fiesta.
And we partied the rest of the afternoon. And as a young lender, I thought that was outstanding. But I asked the question. They said they celebrated every clean loan closing they did in their organization.
Are you advocating fiesta for as a best practice?
Yes, for a good, clean SBA loan close, exactly as the authorization requires. I think maybe you should celebrate in some form or fashion.
Very good. 60-40, very good. Do you have a person in your bank responsible for making sure that the SBA loan is dispersed according to the SBA loan authorization? Good question. It needs to be done.
Well, I think the disbursement of an SBA loan, Bob, is so critically important to getting paid on the guarantee if the loan defaults at some point in its life, especially if it's an early default. I like to see a bank have 1, 2, 3, however many is appropriate, but a group that's responsible for ensuring that the loan is dispersed according to the authorization and that there's appropriate documentation to support that disbursement. Just went through this with a bank in the Midwest who had a guaranteed purchase, and they had submitted their purchase demand kit to Herndon, to SBA, and everything was good except for proof of disbursements. And we had to spend a significant amount of time and effort to document that as best we could. Had it been documented properly, Bob, on the front end by the closer, by those people involved on the front end, it would have been a very easy process. So the only reason I raised this one is dispersing the loan properly and documenting those disbursements is a very, very important part of the SBA lending process.
You're not going to get an argument from me. Number 4. How many early default SBA loans have you had this year? Do you see
I
this?
think the nature of SBA lending, Bob, you'll have early defaults.
Yeah, it'll happen.
But this group, the closing group, you guys can make sure your bank gets paid. If the loan is closed properly, if you get your 4506T, your transcript, your reconciliation, if you disperse it properly, if an equity injection was required, that you make sure that occurred and that is documented properly, you make getting paid on an early default SBA loan very simple.
And I apologize if I'm repeating myself, Lance. Sometimes we have multiple sessions going and I forget my scripts. But the Inspector General will review every early default loan within 18 months over $2 million. So
yes, that is correct. So if you have a big early default loan, it's not only going to get scrubbed by Herndon, Little Rock, or Fresno, but the Inspector General will take a look as well.
So just do your job, and it's going to happen. Partnerships break up, people die, there's divorces. We do our case study of the company that's selling trinkets to NASA for the Orion spacecraft, a good little company. If they do something that blows it up, they're out of business. So things happen.
Well, that's why this closing group is so very important, Bob, because those early default loans can easily be handled if the closers do their job well.
Yeah, and as long as you do your job, you're going to be okay. And I'd like your question of, do you have a stopgap? Do you have someone to review? There's certainly nothing wrong with. I know Lance spends a lot of time on gray areas, and sadly, you may have more questions coming out of this course than you came in, but it's on your prudent judgment on how to do some of this stuff. It isn't black and white. It's very gray in what to do. And so it's nice if you have someone else in your organization to bounce it off of. And Lance is always great as a resource partner. I see a lot of emails from former students from Lance.
Yes.
In your SBA, go ahead, Lance.
Well, one thing I was going to share later in the course, we're going to talk about SBA loan reviews. That's an important part of the process after closing. So let's go ahead and move to the next question.
The last poll is your SBA credit memo set up to address the various areas of the SBA loan authorization? Interesting question. Lance, why are you asking that?
Well, I think it's critically important that your credit memo have the information that your credit memo, your loan authorization should have information that flows from one to the other. You should be able to pick them both up, and there needs to be correct corresponding information. Now, here's something I sometimes see in reviews, Bob. You'll see a credit memo with a different interest rate than what ends up on the authorization, or you'll see a credit memo with different pieces of collateral than what the authorization ends up. You'll see a credit memo with a slightly different loan amount. Those are all mistakes that you really don't need to make if you want to get paid. And that credit memo, we talked about the early default loan and those 4 critical areas that SBA is going to look at. They're going to look at the 4506T transcripts, the equity injection, the use of proceeds, and they're going to look at the credit memo and the underwriting that was used. Well, when they review that credit memo, that SBA servicing officer is going to set it down beside the loan authorization and compare and contrast the information in the two. The best case scenario is when they set your credit memo down beside the loan authorization. There are no variances.
There can't be. There can't be. It needs to be the same. And if you're the closer and you're responsible for putting in that loan authorization, have it match the credit memo.
Absolutely.
So I assume that's what you talked about this week?
Credit memos, the loan authorization. I cannot overemphasize the importance of the loan authorization. If you have changes to the loan authorization, how to get those approved, and use of proceeds, the importance of the disbursements, how to document them. It's a very important week. The credit memo, the loan authorization, and disbursements and use of proceeds are some of the most important parts of a proper closing of an SBA loan.
And I understand the closers don't write the credit memo, but I certainly would empower yourself. If you see something in a credit memo that doesn't make sense, go sit down and talk with the underwriter and say, hey, what are you doing here?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, don't be intimidated by that, especially if you're closing loans. You're going to see a lot more loans than that underwriter. So
there is no doubt about that.
Let's go to the email questions. For loans over $350,000, is there a minimum global cash flow requirement? The SOP says 1.15 to 1, but I'm not able to verify if there is a global requirement on these larger loans.
Well, the SOP doesn't talk about a global.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. You're right. You're right, I misspoke.
The SOP doesn't talk about a global, but my recommendation is your global cash flow or debt service coverage ratio needs to at least be the 1.15. I mean, and again, if you look in your regular commercial lending policy, just because SBA doesn't indicate a required global debt service coverage ratio, you probably have one in your commercial lending policy. I know we do at this bank, and that's the policy that you're going to need to follow.
Yeah, and you can even make it a little bit more simple. Just the global cash flow has to be greater than, it has to be positive, above and beyond the 1.15. So.
Absolutely. SBA requires 1.15. I think a minimum standard would be 1.15 for global.
Yeah. Number 2. Business startups. Does SBA require a startup company projected cash flow in the first year of operation? Is it even realistic to show? Is it to allow that? Can we show a net loss for year 1 and then net loss and then positive in year 2?
Okay, Bob. I'm going to answer this from my Small Business Development Center days. I was director of a Small Business Development Center for 7 years and worked in another Small Business Development Center as a senior consultant. Spent a lot of my time putting together SBA loan packages for borrowers and banks. A projection is just that. It's a projection. I think you need to at least have 1-to-1 debt service coverage.
You have to
in your projection.
In year 1.
I mean, I don't see why you couldn't. I mean, I don't see why it would not be standard practice for you to look for that in the projection.
Yeah.
So again, on a projection for a new startup company, loan under $350K, you want a debt service coverage ratio projection of at least 1-to-1.
Yeah, and the SOP demands it in other areas, Lance, as you know. It says, hey, in the 1920, it says, do we have enough working capital for this business to survive for the next 12 months? You're certifying it. No, it has to, if they can't turn a profit year one, they need friends, fool, or family financing to help them out.
And the reality of small business ownership, I had a small business for 7 years. That first year sometimes will not have positive cash flow.
Yeah.
That's the reality. But a projection is a best case scenario. I mean, it's what they think they can do. So my experience over 30 plus years in small business lending, if you have a startup business projecting negative cash flow and a less than 1-to-1 debt service coverage ratio, their performance is probably going to come in below that. Yeah. The ones that come in that are projecting, for instance, a 1.5 debt service coverage ratio, they may come back to 1.1 or 1.0. So again, it's just a projection. It needs to be at 1-to-1.
Absolutely. Another question on global cash flow calculations. I like your answer, and this is prudent. Hey, do what you do on your SBA loans as your conventional loans. And I think that's so important, Lance. Just because it's an SBA loan doesn't mean we're going to treat it any differently. It's a small business loan.
Well, and there are tons of areas in the SBA SOP that refer back to prudent lending. But also when a loan goes into liquidation and SBA is reviewing your loan package, it's not unusual for them to ask for a copy of your commercial lending policy. It doesn't happen every time, but when there's an area where they think maybe you stretched it just because it was an SBA loan, and it's an area of prudent lending, they'll want to see what you would do on a similar size non-SBA loan.
And the next question is a long one. I can't even read it. Go ahead, Lance. Tell me what's going on here.
Well, yeah, this is a long one. It's talking about the Cavers list. Somebody was on it.
What is the Cavers list?
It is. In fact, Bob, I just got our bank, or I just got set up on Cavers yesterday. Our bank was set up, but I got a personal login. It is a HUD database that allows you to go in. SBA lenders have the option of going in, and you can find out whether or not someone has defaulted on a federal government loan. So, and having a Cavers report is required on all delegated lendings, and that's not just PLP, but express lending is also delegated lending. So part of your SBA file should include that Cavers report. So they had a loan that was same institution debt. It was on unreasonable terms. The applicant was at one point on the Cavers list, but they took care of the past due obligation and they were removed from it. As long as this loan meets SBA's SOP 5010-5H requirements for same institution debt refinancing, it's going to be okay. Now, somebody that was on the Cavers list, Bob, I want to take a deep dive into their credit information and make sure that it's a prudent lending decision to make that loan. Because being on the Cavers list means at some point you're behind or defaulted on a federal government obligation, whether that be a FHA loan, a SBA loan, a student loan. So, I mean, I would take a very deep dive into their personal credit to make sure it's a loan that makes good, prudent lending sense.
Does a bankruptcy wipe that out? It says it has to be fully satisfied. Do they recognize bankruptcy or no?
I'm not sure, Bob, but my expectation is when I don't think it will, because if you have a Chapter 7 with a discharge, it's still going to show up as a federal government agency that lost money on a loan that was made to you. So I think you're still going to end up on the Cavers list.
Last question. Do you or does anybody have a loan review checklist that they would be willing to share with us?
I like the lender's risk-based review form. I talk about it later in this program. It's a great checklist for reviewing your SBA loans. Not only, and my recommendation on SBA loan review, the 2 times at a minimum would be after it's fully dispersed. I always like to see a loan reviewed at that point. And then if it does go into liquidation, I like to see it reviewed at that point. And my recommendation is the lender's risk-based review form. I actually sent it out to this banker. If you'll go to the SBA website, www.sba.gov, and just type in risk-based review, it'll be the first thing that comes up, and you can download it and use it at your bank.
Very good. Tell us about week 3.
Week 3, we're going to start talking about the credit memo and the SBA Form 1920 and how the information from those two. We talked about today the loan authorization, the credit memo, and how the information needs to blend together. And the same thing is true with the credit memo and the SBA Form 1920, which is your lender's application for the SBA loan. We continue to talk about the 1920 and eligibility questions. Credit elsewhere rule, what you need to do to prove, and there were in fact some changes, Bob, that started October 1st, and we have those changes in here.
Minor, but they should be noted.
Yeah, they were not significant, but there were a couple of changes, and as you see, the final thing we talk about are recent changes to the SBA Form 1920. So it's a good week. We're going to look at the lender's application part and get an understanding of that credit elsewhere rule.
And I encourage you all to read the 1920. It's read it, not in the heat of battle, not in the heat of closing a loan. Read it on a higher level, on a Zen level.
Absolutely.
And with that, everyone enjoy the weekend. We'll talk to you next Friday. Thank you very much.
Have a great weekend.